But it's my delight to introduce you to Carissa, as I said, Veliz, who is an academic at Oxford, who's written this amazing book, Privacy is Power. I've got it here somewhere, Carissa, but I should have got it out first. But and I also have the great and amazing Roger McNamee, who's a very dear friend who I got to know, I think, back in 2019. And whenever I talk about Roger, I always say that he's a venture capitalist who's been radicalized by the tech algorithms, but not in the usual way. So we'll come to that. And I think one of the things to say is that the whole ethos and understanding of what we're trying to do with these Substack lives is to just have a really, really informal conversation with really great experts, but to not be preachy and to not be formal. And if you've got questions, do please put them in the chat and we shall try and come to some of those. But I think, what I was going to say to you guys is this is such a difficult topic to understand, I think, and it's largely invisible and it's really, really difficult to get our heads around. So I think today, really try and explain in really simple terms what we mean by this digital surveillance and what it means. And I wonder, Carissa, do you think you could just kick off with that? Just in really broad, assume we know nothing and tell us like what your sort of diagnosis and what you're so alarmed about in terms of this subject.
Yeah. So when I started researching this topic, I was interested in from a very philosophical, very abstract perspective. And the more I researched, the more I realized it was a political topic, which it wasn't clear to me from the start. Basically, in the 1990s, your phone was a phone. It made calls. But today, your phone is a spy in your pocket. It's collecting all kinds of data from you from the moment you wake up. Everyone you call, everyone you message, everything you look up, where your location is, how fast you drive, how you walk, who you're coming into touch with. And all of that is being sent to hundreds of companies across the world who are essentially making out a fear about you and then selling it on to the highest bidder. Sometimes it's insurance companies, sometimes it's banks, sometimes it's governments. And this became the business model of the internet. And what used to be spyware, or really the kinds of tactics that we used against criminal suspects, became the fundamental business model of the internet. And I think people were very naive about it. Either we didn't know, and the people who knew just thought this was kind of a great creative idea. And what we didn't realize is the relationship between surveillance and control. We get this narrative from tech companies that surveillance is completely neutral, that it's just a tool, that it depends on how we use it, but it's not. Every tool is made for something, and surveillance tools are made for control. And because we're social beings, the thing we control the most and the thing that we're interested in the most is other people. And so we are building this surveillance structure that anybody can take over, that anybody can use. And I want to suggest that it's not a coincidence that we are going through perhaps the most concerning decline in democracy that we've experienced in the last 80 years at the same time as the rise of digital tech that is based on surveillance.
So, Roger, you were the person who tipped me off about Carissa's work and onto this book, Privacy is Power. Can you tell me why this subject in particular came to really concern you and scare you, I believe?
So when I was a venture capitalist, I got involved in the very early days with companies like Amazon and Google and then Facebook. And I wound up mentoring Mark Zuckerberg for 3 years in the early days of Facebook. And then in 2016, long after I had stopped mentoring Mark and after I'd stopped being an investor, I started to notice people were using Facebook to interfere in democracy. And the thing that really alarmed me was Brexit in the United Kingdom. And so I looked at this and I went, wow, the same tools that are being used to help people connect with friends can be used to teach people's understanding of politics and to manipulate their emotions and therefore their behavior. So that's how I got radicalized about this. And I reached out to Zuckerberg and Sandberg before the US election in 2016 to say, hey, guys, I assume that you understand this is a really bad idea and you shouldn't want to eat it. Of course, they didn't care. And so from that moment forward, I became an activist trying to make people aware of this. And when Carissa's book came along, it was the first time that somebody had put all in one place in plain English the scope of the problem that I saw and offered a how-to for dealing with it.
Mm. So to go to that, Carissa, I mean, the thing which is sort of important to note, isn't it, is this is an unintended consequence of what was essentially a means of just selling us more stuff, wasn't it? These tech companies, they weren't looking at this for a sort of nefarious use. They were like, if we just have more information about Carole and what kind of things she likes to buy on the internet, we will, and what we know about her and where she lives and how old she is and all the rest of it, we're just going to be able to target me with better ads. And that's all fine. This is just capitalism. It's how capitalism works. Where do you think, the ways that this same information can be weaponized and used against people for harm? Can you just explain that bit of it and whether you agree it wasn't a sort of nefarious intention, but what they've inadvertently set up is this sort of master database of pretty much everybody on the planet?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think most people who came up with this idea and who built the system didn't have particularly bad intentions other than earning money at whatever price sometimes. However, there are many characters in this story, and there were definitely people who knew what was going on. So, for instance, Palantir, the data company, was partly funded and founded by the CIA. And of course, this is a goldmine for intelligence agencies. What used to be extremely expensive and extremely hard to do, follow somebody around and collect all the data about them, is now incredibly easy. So that sometimes for good reasons and sometimes for bad reasons. So it's a very complicated picture and it has a lot of nuance. But basically, it was a huge act of being naive. I think we're sleepwalking into this surveillance state that is very much associated with authoritarian regimes. And we've lost a few lessons from the past. One of them was that privacy is in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights for a good reason. And that's that the Nazis used to use personal data to find people. And so we had a very fresh lesson of why privacy is important. Personal data is very sensitive, and there will always be someone who would want to abuse it, whether it's in the context of war or whether it's in the context of business or personal relationships or criminals. And we lost that. And we partly lost that because the digital is so abstract. If you imagine being in the savannah like thousands of years ago and as we evolved, if you suddenly got the feeling that somebody was watching you, you got scared. You got a visceral reaction because it was very tangible that you might be prey. Whereas with data collection, it doesn't feel like anything to have your data collected. Most of the time, you don't even realize, let alone track where it goes and what are the implications. And so the political consequences of it become all the more down the line and all the more abstract and invisible.
And it's so interesting that. So I was having a conversation earlier this afternoon with somebody who is very alarmed at what's happening in Europe and who grew up in Argentina. So had this really, personal recollection of what it was like living in a country under sort of authoritarian assault. And so understood the framework of the way that these sort of power structures work and understands that, therefore, in the digital context. Roger, I want to go to you because in the US, it seems to me there's just not this sort of collective historical memory of the ways in which societies can use personal information for illegitimate and for dangerous ends. And it's for that reason that there has been nothing. There has been really, at the federal level, certainly, no legislation at all in place that goes any way to protecting individuals, is there?
So, Carole, the issues here, I think, began right after 9/11 in the United States, where there was this enormous surge of fear about terrorism. And that was used as essentially an argument for massive surveillance. And so the government empowered Google to collect domestic intelligence. And that was where all this began. They legitimized this notion of creating files, which historically would not have been legal in the United States. And it was still not legal for the government to have them. But what could happen is Google could collect this stuff, and then the government would just simply have access to it. And this has been used to circumvent what's known as the Fourth Amendment in the United States, which is the closest thing we have to a right of privacy. And so think of this as dating to 2001. It literally from the formative days of Google's business model. And with the passage of time, I think convenience blinded us. These products delivered massive convenience, and that blinded us to what we were giving up. And in my mind, the danger that we have today is that with the new presidential administration, we've seen a combination of state power with tech power. So suddenly, these people aren't doing this for selling more stuff to you. They're doing it to actually manipulate behavior. And so each new generation technology is doing this in ways that are more harmful than the one that preceded it. So I assume at some point in this conversation, we'll talk about the progression that we've seen from smartphones and social media to things like crypto and now to large language model, artificial intelligence, because all of these things are extending this model in ways that are likely to be incredibly harmful and very hard to reverse.
Mm. Yeah, well, tell me about that, Carissa, because even since you've written this book, the technology's advanced and in sort of alarming and very new directions. Where you talk to me about where you sort of see the direction of travel, and to Roger's point about the way that sort of the new large language models feed into this landscape.
Yeah, it's very depressing that the book is still so relevant. I wish that it wasn't anymore. But basically, nothing has changed other than we've extended surveillance. And large language models make it very easy to surveil because they make it very easy to sift through data very, very quickly and to search not only for things like keywords, which we already were able to do, but search for ideas and connect ideas together. But there is a very dangerous and interesting relationship between how evil a system can be and how the people within that system may or may not be as evil. So here, I find it very helpful to think about Hannah Arendt's concept of the banality of evil. This idea that we tend to think about evil as really bad people wanting to do harm. And certainly there are those people in the world. And one of the dangers is that this kind of technology can really empower them. And whereas we talk about technology democratizing power, and we don't necessarily want to give it too much power to just anyone. But there's also the opposite effect that most people in the system aren't particularly evil, but that doesn't make the system not evil. And so you have these people who are just cogs in the system who just contribute to one more app that does something else, something like images, and one more app that collects data. And when you put it all together, then when you get exposed to someone who does have nefarious intentions, like swaying elections, then it becomes really explosive.
Well, that's such an interesting idea, Carissa. That's and it's interesting that you're coming at this you're in the School of Philosophy, aren't you? Which in itself is quite interesting because it's coming at the subject of technology from a kind of something which has already got a framework of understanding the bigger picture. And it feels, Roger, I don't know about you, but it feels like one of the problems we've had in understanding the role of technology in our society is so much of the interpretation is coming through the actual technologists, the tech bros themselves. And this thing of having people, with a sort of another rigorous framework of thinking about these issues is such a sort of needed corrective, really, to our whole understanding of the situation.
Carole, this is a really important point because from 1956, when Silicon Valley started, until almost 2010, the products that Silicon Valley produced, for the most part, empowered people. They increased business productivity. You could trust Silicon Valley. You could trust its products. But a transition happened between 2004 and 2010, where the industry realized it no longer needed to empower people. It no longer needed to increase productivity. It could use data to manipulate people and to effectively extract value from them. And so the big mistake we have all made is we continue to operate with two assumptions that are fundamentally wrong. One is that technology is trustworthy. And second, that new is automatically better than what preceded it. I mean, anyone who uses Microsoft Office 365 or Google Docs can tell you that those products are nothing like as good today as they were in 2010, right? Those products have been enshittified in ways that reduce everybody's productivity. Why? Because they've become extractive. They're just as bad as social media. And people are looking at ChatGPT like it's the next big thing. And I'm looking at it going, no, this is the next big nightmare.
Yeah.
Everything about it is bad. Okay. The fact that it entertains you that's the way that it lures the mark into the system. The only method that we can use to protect ourselves now is to say no, is to refuse to use this stuff.
And it's so interesting. So I was at Roger and I actually met for the first time at the TED conference in 2019. And Roger, as you know, I went back earlier this year in which I, gave this talk to the Silicon Valley bros. But what was so interesting to me is that there was, apart from my talk, it was really every other talk was sort of boostering around AI and the sort of miraculous new world that it was created. And the big new thing everybody was talking about is AI agents. And it's this idea that you're going to have a personal AI agent who you're going to feed more and more of your private information and data to, and that then is going to help you solve all of these real world problems. And I already see this in friends that I know increasingly asking ChatGPT really personal questions. And it's, they're starting already to use this and in a way, I was reading that people are more comfortable in some ways disclosing things to ChatGPT, a non-human, than they would be to a human because they feel like it's less judgmental. Carissa, tell me about what your view on this whole new landscape is and what you would say to anybody who's tempted to do that.
Yeah, I'm pretty horrified, and I have people very close to me who take who do that, and it drives me crazy. And already we're starting to see very concerning cases. There was a teenager in Florida who killed himself after engaging very heavily with these kind of chatbots, and his mother is suing the company Character AI. We are starting to see people who are losing the grip on reality. Because they are talking to these chatbots that very often are sycophantic. So they tell us what we want to hear. And often when a person is having already trouble, mental health issues, it makes them worse because it encourages whatever delusion they might be engaging with. And there's so much to say. So one thing to say is that democracy is a conversation. And when we delegate the conversation to chatbots, we're losing our place at the table of democracy. And one of the news pieces that most caught my attention in the past few months is the Minister of Digital Affairs in the UK asking ChatGPT about GDPR policy and AI policy. And you will not be surprised that the chatbot said that the GDPR is just an obstacle and we need to kind of move past it. So that's another thing. These chatbots are not neutral. They are built by companies with very clear financial interests. So every time you ask them about AI, they come up with this spiel about how it's very sophisticated and yes, it has some trouble, but we're all fixing it and it's going to be perfect kind of thing. And we were talking about how tech people are mostly responsible for the narratives that we are believing. And so I really think that the antidote to the problems of technology is more philosophy and more analog life. Really, if you think about it, everything that matters in your life is analog. Your body is analog, where you live is analog, your relationships are analog, the food you eat, what you drink. And when we engage so much in the digital and we neglect the analog, we really do it at our own peril. One consequence is that when you go back to the analog, you might have lost it and you can't recover it. And the whole natural world is analog. And everything digital depends on the analog. It's resources, it's energy, it's minerals. So we're really losing that connection to the analog in virtue of something that is at best a ghost that surveils us, that we don't control, that oppresses us, and neglecting what's most important in life.
And Roger, so you have been a really clear-sighted critic and I think a sounder of the alarm in terms of these Silicon Valley companies and the road that they are leading us down. Obviously, what has happened now in the States with Trump, not just with Trump coming to power, but with his alliances with these different tech companies, we are now, all of those warnings have turned out to be true. Where are you at in your head at the moment of the alarm that needs to be sounded now about how much worse you feel this is going to become?
So, Carol, the alarm that I was sounding was that big tech's economic interests would lead it to destroy democracy. It's in big tech's interest to get rid of democracy. It did not occur to me that they would be able to combine tech power with state power as quickly as they did once Trump came into power. So people accuse me of being hyperbolic for 9 years talking about this stuff. And the reality is at least 10 times worse than my worst case that I talked about. So that's a big problem. The way I solve it is very simple. I just point out to people there are two things that you should think about. You now have a lot of evidence about what people like Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk and the executives at Microsoft and Google and Amazon like. And you should ask yourself, do they strike you as people who are likely to take into account the interests of a broad number of people? Are they people that you want to be in charge of the decisions of the country you live in? I would argue quite clearly not. Okay. The second thing I would point out, let's just look at large language model AI for just a sec. They have proposed that this thing is going to be intelligent and it's going to change everything. I have no doubt it will change everything, but it's not going to make anything better. And the reason is very simple. The technology is idiotic. It is literally moronic. The notion is you take a massive collection of historical data gathered from everywhere, including places like Reddit and other sources of total nonsense. You're then going to apply a normal distribution to it in order to find the most likely answer to any question you ask. Now, when in the history of humanity has the definition of intelligence been finding the average solution based on historical data? Never. Intelligence is about the ability to confront things that are brand new, that you have never seen before, and find a reasonable path forward. These things will never do that. They will never be intelligent in any reasonable way. What they have done instead is to focus on a user experience that fools you into thinking you're dealing with a human. It preys on our natural vulnerability to anthropomorphic systems, which is something that has been clear since the 70s with the original ELIZA experiment. The guy who invented that came out and said, whoa, all this stuff is really dangerous. Don't do this. And here we are doing it again and pretending like somehow this time it's going to be better. You have got to be kidding me. Look at these people.
What I love about this, Roger, is because, you are absolutely have been at the real sharp end of understanding and making big decisions and big bets are on these tech companies. Like you really understand the finances of it. And what I love about your sort of diagnosis of what we see happening in the great AI race is that you think it's all just a sort of another bubble. And we've seen so many of these tech bubbles before, right?
It's not just another bubble. It's the biggest bubble ever. There are at least 5, and I think you can make a case that there are 6 essentially identical programs, all trying to become a monopolist in large language models. So Microsoft and OpenAI, who I think are going to come apart, then Google, Amazon, Meta, and XAI. So 6 guys. They've already invested roughly $500 billion. There'll be at least $600 billion by the end of this year. They're talking about investing more than that next year. Now, here's the problem. In industry, no more than 2 companies are going to be profitable. I mean, go back and look. That's how things work, which means 3 and maybe 4 of these guys are going to go out of business, and relatively soon. There's just no room for them. That's assuming the technology works, which it doesn't. And then there's another problem. The Chinese replicated what these guys are doing for 1% of the cost, which suggests the underlying technology actually has no value. When this bubble bursts, we're going to have roughly $1 trillion worth of value loss. That's real money. And investors are going along like, la-di-da, this is the only thing that matters. Governments are going along like, wow, we got to be involved in this. And I'm sitting there going, no. You want to go back to 2010, the last time tech made people more productive and empowered them. And we want to get back on that thing. Canada, the EU, they need to basically get their elbows up and replace all the US tech stack with stuff that doesn't harm people.
Yeah, so I love this in that. So, Roger, you just have this really long historical memory of what Silicon Valley does. And this hype cycle is something we have seen repeatedly happening. And Carissa, to go to you at this point, you're sitting in the UK. As Roger says, his diagnosis, which I totally agree with, which is that the United States is essentially, that's been captured now by the tech companies. They're now allied to the Trump administration. But we're in Britain here, in Europe, elsewhere in the world, we should be heeding this warning, right? That these companies should be nowhere near our own governments. We should be looking for alternatives which aren't in the capture of what is now an authoritarian regime. I think, we used that word last week on doing this Substack live. What do you make of the sort of ongoing naivety, I suppose, of the people making these decisions in Britain, in Europe, and elsewhere?
It's been a bit tempered. So we're seeing already concern, especially from Europe, in government about using these tools and especially depending on these tools for communication, for data collection, for everything. So we saw just a few weeks ago Denmark wanting to move away from using the usual suspects and developing their own technology. So I also have some faith in the ability of people to innovate. I think we deserve better tech. Tech is not God-given. It's designed by us, and we get to say what it's like, and we could have designed it differently. So one example I like to give is in the 1930s, there were as many petrol cars in New York City as there were electric cars. And the reason why the petrol car won that race was because of a few flukes. One of them was that the US found cheap petrol. Henry Ford was a fantastic businessman, and the company that ran the electric cars got heavily mismanaged in a way that had nothing to do with the technology. But we could imagine a different kind of AI. AI doesn't necessarily need so much data. And in fact, as Roger was mentioning, this idea that you just throw money at the problem, you increase the data, and it's going to magically become intelligent has its limits. And one suggestion that it's already kind of hit the limit is that we seem to have run out of data, pretty much. And still, these systems make incredible mistakes that we have no reason to think they're going away because their statistical analysis and a statistical response is not the same as the truth. So, the ancient Greeks had this rough concept of probability, and they called it likeness to truth. So it quacks like truth. It looks like truth, but it's actually not the same thing. And so in Europe, I want to encourage people, yes, to think about How do we become independent? But also, how do we design better tech? We deserve better, and better technology is possible. And also, how do we change the framework and the narrative? And even in the language. So that, tech companies have come up with this language and we bought it and we use it unreflectively. But even the term data collection, I find it incredibly misleading, because it seems to suggest that just data is out there and we're collecting it like we collect berries in the forest. But data is not out there. Every time you collect data, you actually created data. And that act of creation is morally significant because it's a very sensitive thing and it's very hard to keep it safe. And in a democracy, there are very good reasons not to create certain kinds of data to keep the citizenry safe.
And what about, Roger, has it affected, what do you do differently now that you understand this problem? And specifically, being a US citizen and seeing what is happening to your government?
So the first thing that I tell everybody is to recognize that this is now a pervasive problem. You can't trust any of these people or any of the problems. So there have been no whistleblowers out of either Microsoft or Google from their enterprise applications businesses yet, but they both changed their terms of service. And I think if you use Google Docs or if you use Microsoft Office 365, you have to assume that all of your data is being ingested into their AIs, and that if somebody asks a very clever prompt, they're going to be able to actually surface your raw data with attribution. And so I look at this and I go, wow. So first thing is stop using the damn products. Okay. I mean, I had a Microsoft Exchange server for my life, right? Tens of thousands of dollars. Microsoft was so determined to move us off it that they literally killed that product. 2 years after I bought it, it was brand new. And, so I'm moving, Carissa knows this company, I'm moving my email to Proton because it's secure. I do all of my, Carissa's on the board there, and that's a terrific company. I use Signal, which is the way I do texting, right? That's how all of us communicate. And it's how I communicate, not just private things, but just everything, right? And, I'm getting off. I've been off of Google for 6 years, everything but YouTube. I've been off of Facebook for 6 years. And, I just don't use any of those things. And, people say, oh my God, you're not connected. I'm going, I'm really sorry. But for me, COVID was amazing. I mean, I got to know you right before COVID. I got to know Carissa during COVID. Many of my most important allies are people I have literally never met in person. I only know them because we circulated in the same activism world. And, we found each other and we became close. And so I look at this and I go, my life is much richer because I've returned to analog. And people sit there and go, oh, I can't imagine giving up my groups in Facebook. I'm going, trust me, there are a million ways to do groups other than Facebook. And being out there is really dangerous. Giving your kids a smartphone when they're 10 years old is insane. Hell, giving them one when they're under 18 is crazy, right? I mean, you do not need to track your kids all day. The world is not actually that dangerous. It's much more dangerous to have a cell phone. It's more dangerous for your kids, right? I mean, giving your kid Minecraft when the kid is 8 years old is nuts. Because Microsoft literally starts tracking these little kids and then follows them from Minecraft to Xbox and from Xbox into Office. And they have them forever. And I'm sitting there going, no, thank you. And the point is, once you stop, the data gets old really quickly. So stopping is a really effective technique for protecting yourself because it reduces the footprint of data they have about you.
It's very interesting. I was listening to this podcast earlier. It's this journalist who's just brought out a book, Amanda Hess, I think she's called, and she was writing about basically the way that children are inducted into sort of the digital sphere, and how she found out she was pregnant, and she just did a single Google search on something like, what do you need to know when you're pregnant, something like that, and she was taken to a site we will all have seen, WebMD, which is, I think of as a pretty authoritative source of medical information on the internet. anyway, and then she backtracked and she discovered that data about her having a positive pregnancy test, or what appeared might have been, went to 173 different data brokers and sites. And from the next day, she was inundated with very targeted advertising based upon that. And I thought it was just a single anecdote, but that thing of this, how just a tiny little drop of information becomes part of the sort of surround sound we live in.
But Carole, you're missing the core thing. When I wrote my book in 2019, the big story at that time was that Facebook and Target and others were able to predict with confidence interval about 75% that a woman was pregnant before she knew. They don't need you to do a pregnancy test. They can tell. Look, what do? They get the data from everybody, and they analyze behavior of everyone, and then they look at specific things. So, what do women who are about to be pregnant, when they become pregnant, what have they been doing for the 6-9 months before they got pregnant? Let's track behavior of people who are going to get pregnant. That will let us forecast who's likely to get pregnant. From that set, we can then anticipate that some fairly high percentage of those people actually are pregnant before they know they are. And that has been known since.
One concern is that we're bringing up subjects, not citizens. When somebody is surveilled that heavily from the time before they're born, from the time they're conceived, they've never known what life is like with privacy. And part of growing up needs privacy to push the limits, to explore the forbidden, to ask uncomfortable questions. And if you never have that privacy, in a way, there's a risk that you never grow up. But one of the things I actually wanted to ask you, Carole, as a result of your previous questions, is what is your experience as a journalist? Because one of my concerns when it comes to democracy is that if you don't have privacy, you don't have investigative journalism, because sources cannot approach a journalist safely anymore. And one suggestion that is the case is in the Pegasus scandal, where this software was used to hack people around the world, and in particular activists and journalists and academics. The country that was best represented in the list of targets was Mexico. And Mexico is also one of the countries in which most journalists are assassinated every year, even more than countries in war. So what do you do as a journalist, Carole? And what do you experience as a journalist trying to shield sources from this invasive surveillance?
I mean, I became very aware of it when I started writing about these issues. And one of the first things which made me super paranoid was when, I started actually, before I began investigating Facebook, I was looking at Google. And Google started writing very threatening letters to me and my editors at The Guardian and Observer. And I found it mind-blowing that I was writing to my editors about the threats to our reporting from Google, about what we were writing about Google. And I was writing to them on The Guardian's email is based on Gmail. And we use Google Docs. We were using Google Docs for, where our research is. And that sort of blew my mind, because I was like, we have no safe means of communicating here. It's mad. We can't be reporting on the same companies when that technology is actually embedded into the tools that we're using. And so that was one of the sort of very early things for me, which really started me thinking, and really, I have to say, made me, super paranoid. Because understanding that, as you say, Carissa, that you actually have no sort of safe space, it does make you paranoid when you are dealing with sensitive sources and sensitive issues, and when you know that there are very much bad actors who are coming after you. And I think for myself, because I went through this process of legal discovery where I had to give over access to all of my laptop and my devices and my accounts and whatever. I think that personal experience of understanding how anything you've ever written could be taken down as evidence and used against you is a really sort of, on the plus side of it, what I say is that experiencing it so personally and viscerally has given me this sort of deeper understanding of the bigger picture. And so as painful and difficult as it was, I actually think that we all need to undergo some of that personal experience. And to go back to this question around women and pregnancy and all the rest of it, I think that is happening in the States now, in that was one of the first wake-up calls after Roe v. Wade was passed, women understanding that these period tracking apps could be used as evidence against them in now places where it has been, criminalized to seek healthcare. This, I think it's, I don't know, Roger, I guess to go to you on here about this, do you feel that this sort of wake up call is now coming in the US in understanding that this personal data and information people just give up could be turned and used against them? Or do you feel we're still very much at the beginning of that sort of, I don't know, enlightenment really that needs to happen?
It's very hard for me to tell. It feels that we're still extremely early. When I first began my activism, and the public-facing part of it, I began in 2017. The questions people asked me in 2017 are the same ones they're asking today. And I think people are incredibly busy. And so part of the reason they're so busy is because the technology has been transformed by technology to essentially dump tasks companies used to do for you in your lap, right? And so now everything is self-service. You have to do all the work yourself. You're interacting with these platforms constantly. And you don't have a choice because in the United States in particular, our economy is totally monopolized. And so my experience with this whole thing is that it's really hard for people to get unplugged from this stuff. If your child is in a middle school, the odds are there is a parents' Facebook group that you have to be on because the schools haven't gotten this stuff. And part of the reason they haven't is because these companies have used U.S. law to effectively buy off politicians at every level to prevent any kind of change. And we collectively have not insisted on our politicians actually representing our interests. And that's a hard thing to get over. And what worries me is that we've come to a place where it's just going to be a lot of people are going to get hurt, or a lot more than are already being hurt. And what's so weird is everyone's being hurt; they're just not aware of it. They think that's how life is, right?
Mm-hmm.
Nothing I can do about it. And every little kid. I mean, I was expecting little kids to rebel. When I was a little kid, we all rebelled against the older generation. And these young kids, they can't wait to get this technology. And they all want to be influencers. And I'm sitting there going, wow, that's grim. And so if you're a parent, I do think that this is very hard. The social structures are aligned against you.
So, Carissa, can we just go, you're the person who's really dived, can you talk to us about what are the things that we can and should be doing? Let's try and be positive and practical at this point. Give us your top tips.
So I have a whole chapter on them, on private use power, as you know. And it depends on who you are. It depends on where you live, if you're a journalist, if you have children or not. But in general, make an effort without making yourself crazy. And it's not that hard. First of all, we have much more power than we think we have. Part of the interest of tech companies is making us feel powerless. But actually, companies are very sensitive to changes in behavior. You don't need to be perfect. Even a small change gets noticed. And so instead of using WhatsApp, use Signal. Instead of using Gmail or something like that, use ProtonMail. And yeah, I'm the board of the foundation. But because I believe in it, instead of using something like Google search, use DuckDuckGo or StartPage. There is a website called privacytools.io, and it gives you alternatives to basically everything that you have. So instead of using Dropbox, you can use Proton Drive. There are alternatives for every service, and they work really, really well. But more generally, notice that protecting your privacy is an act of defiance, and is an act of protecting democracy as well. So my favorite act of defiance is going to a bookstore, buying a paperback, and just reading silently without touching your phone for a while. It really is an act of defiance. And in general, if you want to have a good party, then ask your friends not to take photos, much less upload them. And so Amal Clooney once cited a few days ago saying that she has a basket, and when she invites the friends over, she asks them to leave the phone in the basket. If you want real intimacy, leave the phone out of the room. If you want to have a very frank conversation with your students or with your friends, turn off the microphones and cameras and cherish the analog, because that's all that matters. And it needs to be taken care of. And when we don't take care of it, we lose it.
So, Carole, can I offer some positive things?
Yeah.
So I think big tech is incredibly vulnerable. That the novelist Cory Doctorow came up with a term called inshitification to describe the business model. That basically they lure you in with a product that's really appealing and it changed your life, and you literally move everything mountains in order to use these products. That's how every one of them begins. Then they have to monetize, and they slowly degrade your experience in order to increase their profitability. And this is true of every tech product. He initially noticed it with Facebook, but it's really true of even Microsoft Office. So because they're alternative, if enough people made the switch at once, you would completely destabilize these guys because they can't respond. The Danish government has moved off of Microsoft Office and onto an open source product called LibreOffice, Libre Office, which is essentially identical. It's just that you can run it on your own server, so none of your data gets shared. Now, that's a really smart thing to do. And frankly, every government other than the United States should be doing that tomorrow. And what's weird is if everybody did that at once, these guys would implode. And what's really great is they're probably going to implode because of how stupid they're being in AI. The critical thing is we have to change our behavior so we make that happen sooner rather than later. Okay? They are incredibly vulnerable. And as Carissa says, we have much more power than we realize.
I love that line. It's kind of interesting, and it's something that's because it's something that I try and hold on to as well. In that, because as you say, Carissa, that there is making us feel powerless is the way to which makes us stopping doing anything to change our behavior, because you feel it doesn't matter and it won't make any difference. Whereas actually, there are more of us, and we do have the power. We do have consumer power, which is because they treat us as consumers and not as citizens. So actually exerting our consumer rights is, maybe it's a first step to getting back some of our rights as citizens. Do you think, Roger? Where do you feel that, as you are in the States, which is now facing this sort of democratic emergency?
I think the prescriptions that Carissa offered are the ones. And my contribution to this is simply pointing out that these businesses are much more fragile than they appear. The reason they're so focused on AI is because their old businesses are dying. And if we would just stop using ChatGPT and stop using things that look like it, stop pretending that they're authoritative. And if we look for alternatives for the old products we use, stop using Gmail, stop using Microsoft Office. Those are things which have very low friction for making change. Now, get off of Gmail. Seriously, get off of Gmail. Get off of Microsoft. That what you really want to do is get control of your life back. And I'll tell you, you feel so empowered when you do it. You feel really good about yourself.
I also want to say that there's pleasure in it. I don't know about you, but it used to be the case that for me, it was hard to put my phone down. It was addictive, social media or whatever else. But now the experience has become so unpleasant that it's quite a pleasure to just put the phone away for hours. And I think we've forgotten that pleasure of being in the present moment with your friends, with your family, with a good book. I also want to end on a note about why it matters to do the right thing. Like so many times people will say like, well, but will it make a difference, or what's going to happen in the future? And of course, those things matter and we should ask them, and we should be efficient and we should be strategic. But also sometimes it's just about doing the right thing. And it doesn't matter whether you lose or win. Some battles need to be fought. This is our world. This is our society, our democracy, and we are partly responsible for creating it. We do our part. And there is incredible satisfaction and pleasure in it. Actual pleasure. Doing the right thing is a pleasurable thing. Whether you win or lose. And, reading a good book, spending time with your family, with your friends, and being a good citizen. Democracy is not only about results, it's not only about elections, it's a way of life. And it's a creative way of life. We stop creating and we just leave it for others. We create a void of power, and it will be filled by whoever is powerful and whoever has the ideas. So we shouldn't leave our place at the table.
So, okay, I think we should wrap it up there. I have to say, the thing which has really struck me most from this conversation, well, two things, I think. So, Roger, I love that fact that actually they're in real trouble, and that's why they're just chucking money at this shitty technology which doesn't work. And I think preaching that message to people is really important, because at the moment we're imbuing these technologies with kind of magical powers. And I think the thing that you said, Carissa, which really strikes me, is around this idea that no part of the system is the fact that the entire system actually adds up to something which is evil. I mean, you use that word and you make the comparison to Hannah Arendt and this banality of evil, which we all by participating in it, we are in a way complicit in the entire system, which we can already see is being weaponized and used against some of the most fragile and vulnerable people around. And in the US, for example, we see it around the way that immigrants are being treated. They are being profiled and surveilled and targeted in exactly the kind of ways that we're talking about. And I think thinking about the ways that most vulnerable people are treated and how eventually that's going to come for us too. I don't know. That seemed like a very striking way that you described it. So I guess any final thoughts, or should we wave goodbye? Roger, give me your final sentence to take people out into the evening.
Everyone needs to buy Carissa's book, Privacy is Power.
Oh my God.
Okay. I mean, seriously, it changed my understanding of a problem. I'd already been studying that problem for years. And the thing is, it's the only book ever written on this topic that's in plain English. Okay.
Yeah.
And you will feel empowered, and read it in analog form. Get a print copy of it. Okay.
There you go. Carissa, you couldn't have asked for a better outro from Roger. Well,
thank you so much, Roger. That was very generous.
Do you have a final? Have you got any final words?
Life is analog. The digital is but a ghost.
I love it. Okay. All right. We're going to say goodbye to our digital ghosts here and go out into our human and analog evenings. Thanks so much for joining me. Thanks everybody who joined. Sorry about our tech difficulties, but we'll be back here more or less the same time, I think, next week.
Will there be a recording of this that will be up?
There will be a recording, which we will send out. Yeah. Brilliant. Thanks, guys. Thanks so much. Cheerio. Bye.